Welcome to another episode of Our Interesting Times. It's my pleasure to have John Haskins on the show. John is a senior fellow for the Public Understanding of Law, Propaganda, and Cultural Revolution at the Inter-American Institute for Philosophy, Government, and Social Thought. He analyzes politics, society, the ongoing decline of the constitutional government, and the root causes of the failures and retreat of conservatism and religion in American society, and just maybe the world in general. So, John, how are you doing this evening? Thanks for coming on the show.
Oh, I'm doing fine. Thanks, Tim.
Is there anything else you want to add to that?
Oh, no. I bet you did it. That's
okay.
Fine.
So, John, you've looked into, the conservative movement. You've had some things to say about some of these organizations, particularly the Council for National Policy and its role in not only in conservatism, but in sort of the, politics, American politics, particularly since the 1980s, the conservative 80s, the Reagan era, and these things. And there's been some talk among the alternative media about the role of the Council for National Policy, the CNP, as being sort of a product of a conspiracy, more or less to bamboozle, manipulate the American public. And you have some problems with that term, and perhaps you want to refine it or maybe provide a better explanation of what exactly the role of the CNP is and how it relates to the wider, the wider American political system and power structure.
Yeah. Now, first, do you want to explain what the CNP is for your audience, or do you think everyone will know?
No, actually, we can get into it. The CNP, I believe the CNP was founded in the early 1980s, 1981. It grew out of the John Birch Society, the Western Goals, I think, Foundation, and it was sort of created as part of a conservative analog or counterpart to the Council for Foreign Relations, which has sort of been seen, I think, quite correctly, as sort of a coordinated committee for, the New World Order, for lack of a better term, but basically the corporations, the banking interests that form the power structure of the Anglo-American empire. And, of course, the Council for Foreign Relations was formed in 1921. And it's important to understand the Council for Foreign Relations if you understand the CNP, because the Council for Foreign Relations was formed in 1921 along with the Royal Institute of International Affairs, the Royal Institute of International Affairs. That was, of course, the British analog to the CFR. It both developed out of the Milner Circle and the Rhodes Trust, and this idea to coordinate policy among the English-speaking peoples to more or less manage the world. So that's the CFR. Of course, the CFR is housed at Pratt House in New York, and that people like Dulles Brothers came out of there, and they have, obviously experts in foreign policy, economics, culture. They also have, it's a very much large organization. They bring in celebrities and these things, journalists, and so that's their role. Sort of, I'd say, sort of perception management, control ideas, and coordinate policy. And
providing personnel, I think, for various White House.
Well, that's the important thing because often, like the CFR, will staff administrations, the State Department, and later on, of course, the Trilateral Commission would do a very similar thing in the 1970s when David Rockefeller set that up with Zbigniew Brzezinski, and that was in response to the changing conditions in the 1970s to kind of coordinate and rope in Asia into these things, particularly Japan, the Trilateral Commission. And, of course, the Trilateral Commission would dominate the Carter administration. So that's kind of what we're. So the CNP tries to market itself as sort of the counterpart to the CFR and even perhaps to the Trilateral Commission. These New World Order institutions that more or less control successive presidential administrations despite party affiliation. Is that good enough for you, or do you want to add something?
Well, no. I think you probably know more than I do about the CFR, maybe a lot more. My exposure to CNP, again, it's Council for National Policy. If we haven't said that full name, and I think they're in Washington. And as I mentioned to you, I've known, I don't know, I'm just guessing at least 24 current or former members, maybe much more, because you don't always know if someone's a member. And know Steve Baldwin, the former executive director, who was there for close to a decade. And Steve Baldwin, what I'm going to say, I'm going to have to be very coy about how I know some of this, because I shouldn't know some of it. But I think it's safe to say Steve was fired largely because of his perceived activism from within CNP and externally while he was there, and trying to expose Mitt Romney in the 2008 campaign. I was very much involved in that. Steve had access to a lot of my information, and the allegation probably among the senior people at CNP was that he distributed to the media and various mostly conservative movers and shakers information that I and a very small group of other people generated. I have to put it that way because I think Steve probably had a severance agreement where he had to not say anything about CNP that would be damaging or not. So the disclaimer here is I'm not saying Steve Baldwin shared any internal secrets with me, but due to the considerable number of people that I've known who were involved in CNP, I did get what I felt was a very accurate sense of what it was about, not necessarily at the very highest level, where there were some people I considered to be very devious in a way that doesn't necessarily fit into the standard conspiracy theory framework in terms of motivations and agendas. Just that they're people who are cynical and not really going about anything good. The standard complaint about rhino Republicans, that type of a thing, which doesn't have to be a conspiracy.
No, it doesn't. It's just they're careerists, or they're looking for some sort of angle or inside track to profit personally from something.
Exactly, and they shy away. There's always money involved. There's always prestige involved. There's always appeasement of the mainstream media, as far as that can go for people that are self-labeling as conservatives or Republican or whatever. You can only go so far in that pandering to the media. But in the end, people like that are embarrassed to be associated with people who have actual moral convictions and beliefs, and they are always trying to outmaneuver people who have a real value system, and they become skilled at posing as conservatives or as Christians or whatever, and some of them probably think they are.
Yeah, they sort of sell out gradually, so they don't notice it.
Exactly, yeah. And I think that's by far the biggest. I think that's by far the most important way to understand what's wrong with the right and its institutions, as well as the part of American religion that we that sort of labels itself as conservative by one definition. Or I think it's mostly not people that have infiltrated who are really Antichrist or New World Order or anything like that. They're just sleazy people in many cases, and they're chameleons.
Yeah, and obviously those people higher up will find those people rather congenial or easy to work with, because it's very easy to work with someone once you know their price.
That's right.
Yeah, and then you can calculate from that point on, how much you need to pay them, or they'll do anything, for a paycheck, or they won't question anything if their paycheck depends on them not questioning it.
Yeah, and every personality in that category is distinct. I mean, I don't think like someone like a Mike Huckabee is especially similar to a Mitt Romney, or that they're all that similar to a George Bush or Dick Cheney. There's a lot of diversity there in terms of what people are all about. What they share in common is they are posing as people who have deep convictions whenever it's convenient or necessary. Some of them actually do have some kind of convictions. I doubt anyone in the Bush family does, or Cheney or anything. Not convictions that I would, respect. But there are other people, I think, like Mike Huckabee and, maybe Rick Warren, and the people who were, at the nexus of religion and politics or social conservatism, who actually do, in most cases, actually have a belief system. I question whether it is a legitimately Christian and biblical system in terms of the way it works out in their lives. But anyway.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, with the Council for National Policy, the CNP, of course, we mentioned that it was created as a counterpoint, or as a conservative analog to what was considered the more liberal, centrist Council for Foreign Relations, the more corporatist. Well, what's interesting is that people who've analyzed the membership of the CNP found that quite often there are many who interlocking memberships between the CFR and CNP, which would tend to make you question whether it was a genuine, generally opposed to the Council for Foreign Relations.
Yeah, I think there's more than one way to look at that, Tim. The people that I have known who were, in some cases presently are members of the Council for National Policy don't have any strategic sense. They don't have. They're people who fudge things because they see themselves as, right at that perfect balance point between principle and pragmatism. And in the end, what they have to show for it after 30 or 40 years have gone by is absolutely nothing. And if you run something, if you'd have found an organization like the Council for National Policy, and you have this naive idea back in the early 80s that, well, we have Reagan in the White House, and his people are all conservatives and constitutionalists and pro-life and pro-traditional marriage and family and whatever, we're now part of the power system. We're taking America back. And back in those days, even the National Review somehow passed itself off as conservative, and had even more so earlier. And I think there was a headiness, and a hubris. There obviously was, and I think that they could rationalize in their own mind. Oh yeah, you want to join, and you're also a member of CFR. Oh, that's brilliant. Yeah, because we're going to infiltrate them now. I mean, it's that degree of naivete. There's tremendous strategic incompetence, tremendous instinct to compromise, as if, well, we're doing this for God and country, and it's gonna go our way. We win in the end. Well, what has been won in the end in the last 30 or 40 years from any of it? There's nothing to show for it.
And there's an interesting distinction to be made here, or at least an important distinction to be made between an outfit like the CNP and the CFR. Is the CFR, well, it had and it has real clout. I mean, it represents tangible, real interest. It represents the banking interest. It represents the Rockefeller empire. I would say it ultimately represents the Rothschild empire. These things. These are the banking interests. These are the back that created the intelligence agencies, the CIA. So when you talk about CIA, we're not necessarily talking about a bureaucracy, an alphabet soup agency. We're also talking about the milieu of interests that created it, that go back. I mean, these things, at least in the United States, go back to the founding of Skull and Bones and the opium trade and the vast financial fortunes and empires that were built from that trade. That would develop the banking system of the West and the central banking system, and this really that's when you're getting to the higher, you're getting closer to the tip of the pyramid there. Whereas, the activists that were involved in CNP, these, they have no real power. They may be able to marshal some votes and rally the base for a particular election.
I think they've lost that, even if they ever had it.
Yeah.
The CFR itself has obviously outstanding global connections. I don't mean globalist as much as global. Globalist is obviously globalist, but international connections in politics, probably commerce and industry, and certainly in media. But also they have ties to the most prestigious universities, certainly in North America, probably Europe. I mean, they move people around back and forth. They can make a phone call and place someone on a major TV program or radio program. Whereas if you're at the Council for National Policy, you're not the right-wing alternative. Even if you're right wing, you're not the counterpart to CFR because you're not placing people anywhere. You're not. I mean, what you would have is people occasionally like. I think Gene Kirkpatrick was named it, as well as former governor of Wisconsin, Tommy Thompson, others who, some well-known law professors and various other politicians and appointees of Republican administrations who join essentially to get a Rolodex and to get a sort of a veneer of social conservative bona fides. But they're not. It's not like you go through CNP in order to move into power.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't work that way. I don't think they have any clout. And I want to be very clear, by the way, that in case I wasn't, that Steve Baldwin, who was executive director, I have a lot of respect for him. His integrity is one of multiple reasons why I don't think the CNP could have been, in the almost 10 years he was there, an instrument of the CIA or anything like that. Steve is an impeccably conservative Christian man, and it's basically, as far as I'm concerned, I don't want anyone to take this as me relaying a quote from Steve, but in fact, I would say he's probably sacrificed his career because he had more decency and more integrity than his bosses did there, and I would say than the vast majority of the members, I would think, certainly based on the ones that I've known.
Now, good example is, I mentioned that the Council for Foreign Relations is housed in the Pratt Mansion in New York, and of course the name, the former Secretary of State George P. Shultz, that stood for Pratt. And so that shows that the familial connections here, that the people that become Secretary of State, that end up being the president or CEO, of Bechtel Corporation, or these things, they have these family connections that tie back to the Rockefeller Empire, the big oil, these things that really are the financial backbone or the financial center of what we call the establishment. And they have these international corporations, whether it's banking or oil, even fruit, like United Fruit Company. They can make a phone call and have the CIA arrange a coup for their benefit, like they did in Guatemala in 1954, or in 1953 when the Seven Sisters, the oil companies, got the CIA to arrange a coup in Iran because Mossadegh had nationalized the oil fields there and kicked out the British Petroleum. And so that's the name of the game, is that the CIA is an agency acting on behalf of somebody or something, and what they're acting on behalf of all these corporations. That ultimately these transnational corporations with huge resources at their disposal, and because they have these resources at their disposal, they can leverage that power to control governmental policy, and have the agencies themselves sort of socialize the risks of their economic or their business ventures while privatizing the losses. That's what we see played out throughout Africa or Central America or even Europe, and these things. They're doing it for the benefit of these corporations.
Now, what's the connection between what you just said and CNP? Is there?
Oh, no, that's not. I'm saying this is the distinction between CFR and CNP.
You mean that CFR? Yeah, has the money in the cloud.
That's
exactly.
yeah. When you're looking at CFR, you're getting a window into the New World Order, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, I would think at the highest levels or the inner circles. Yeah. I think that's quite clear.
Yeah, whereas CNP, I think the CNP again it was created to. You can make the connection. The CNP perhaps being indirectly linked to the Central Intelligence Agency, because the Central Intelligence Agency is very concerned with controlling domestic politics. In fact, I would argue more so than foreign affairs, is that controlling the domestic front more importantly, because they have to maintain the perception of things, the legitimacy of its mission or legitimacy of American foreign policy and these things. And so propaganda and cultural warfare, psychological warfare is a very important in maintaining the illusion of things, maintaining the illusion that the CIA is an intelligence agency. But by my point, CNP could be an example, I think, of the intelligence agencies and the foundations which interlock with the intelligence agencies, like Ford Foundation or the Rockefeller Foundation, the Carnegie Corporation. They would have an interest in sort of creating grassroots conservative organizations, movement conservative organizations, so they can more or less corral and control the opposition, controlled opposition. And many of the people involved in these organizations have no idea that they're being manipulated, because they're at a certain level. Whereas at the higher level, the funding, the things that can be taught, what's considered acceptable discourse in public affairs is being directed and controlled. And that's how these organizations are controlled. And the CNP would be a good way to control the opposition to make sure that it's manageable. You see what I mean?
I certainly understand the theory, and this reminds me of an interview that, if I remember, you did a few weeks ago with someone called John Adams. Is that right?
Yes, John, yeah.
Okay, and he has a very interesting story along the lines of what you're talking about now, except that it goes into the actual evangelical churches as well in Southern California. I would never have I would never have connected the dots the way he does. I can't say that I absolutely don't believe any of it, but Tim, my experience with evangelicals, leaders, and in the actual church world, but also in the social conservative political activist groups, makes it sort of hard for me to believe that, any of these, I shouldn't say any, but that any substantial number of them are actually, working for the CIA. I realized that, there was a lot of interesting information you did in that interview you did. And one of the things that surprised me is the amazing number of biographical details that connect people like, I think he mentioned, did he mention Tim LaHaye?
Yes, he did.
Now, Tim LaHaye, I think, was one of the founders of CNP. A real sort of, I don't know if fundamentalist is exactly the word, but not the sort of people that, a Gene Kirkpatrick or, a Republican power brokers would want to hang out with. So I think the founding of CNP was largely, as far as I can tell, anyway, instigated by people from, very broadly speaking, the religious right. Now, your friend John Adams got into, people, he listed a whole series of people that had, at some point in their career, had a connection to the CIA or some similar organization. And after I listened to it, it was a very interesting and provocative interview, lots of information. But again, I've never connected the dots that way, and I'm not sure one has to. And I think it doesn't resonate with the sort of psychology of the people that I've encountered. And after that interview, I thought, well, let me look at my background, and I was aware that, I'm from a WASP background, and my father's family, was well connected. My father, grandfather, and great uncle went to Harvard after going to the same boarding school. My great uncle had a seat on the New York Stock Exchange, and then I was going back into family history, which was after listening to that, because I was thinking to myself, someone could look at my family background and even some things in my own biography, my resume, and say, well, maybe he's part of the maybe he's part of the Eastern WASP establishment, and he could be even Illuminati. And it was sort of funny because the more I dug, the more I found, immediate family members going back at least 100 years, and that's where I just stopped. It was sort of something I did for a couple of hours on the internet. Some of it I knew, but I thought, wow, I could actually write myself up as, for example, my father's mother, so my paternal grandmother, her grandfather was a friend of Carnegie, Andrew Carnegie, the steel magnate, and it might have been the same. It might have been her father or grandfather was on the Supreme Court of New Jersey. I was digging these things up, and I thought, well, I could do this. I could paint myself as one of these people that are, it's fun to talk about, but I'm not, and I don't have anything in common with that world except that, there were these connections, and then I briefly worked at MITRE Corporation, which you know MITRE Corporation here in Massachusetts, which does this was years ago, some kind of consulting mainly for the Air Force, I guess, and TRW. So, these are things that are like not even on my resume because they're so minor, but someone could put together those sort of bullet points on loads and loads of people, especially if you're from an East Coast, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant background. Obviously, your family got here 300 or 400 years ago, and you're going to find loads of people, if you start getting into genealogy, who had some kind of political or economic power, or were connected to people who did. And so when John Adams was sort of listing these resume, the factoids about people in the evangelical world, I thought, well, I wouldn't have expected all that, but does it really mean what he says, what he thinks it means?
Yeah, obviously. I too have elements of my background that one could do, make these connections and draw an inference if they wanted to, like employment. Because I live in the Washington D.C. area, the surrounding area, and often if you work in this area, you work for a intelligence or defense contractor at some point or another, and that doesn't necessarily mean you're CIA. That's the, and that, there are too many accusations flying about, in the alternative media about people being shilled. No doubt there are shills, and there's infiltration, there's cognitive infiltration, and just the mere fact that term is used actually it's evidence of cognitive infiltration, because you're sowing division and you're creating suspicion. That's psychological warfare, just that term itself. Even the term conspiracy theory was a product of a conspiracy, and that's admitted by the CIA in their memorandum in 1967 to marginalize those people who were vocally criticizing the report on the JFK assassination, the Warren report. So they wanted to discredit these people, which, by the way, is a violation of the CIA's charter. But that's a whole other story. But manipulating the media. But when you're talking about functions of the intelligence agencies and the interests that they represent, there's no formal CIA. May not be a formal CIA operation or code name or documents and these things. However, people who have done the research have produced pay vouchers and records, particularly financial reports, which exposed MK Ultra. And of course, in the 1970s, we were although I think it was a limited hangout, very much so. We were the public got word of Mockingbird, the manipulation of the American press and media, and I think it goes much deeper than that. Is Hollywood coordinating with the CIA in terms of making movies that were, I guess, congenial to the interests that the CIA represents, and that's become formalized now with the liaison office between CIA and Hollywood, and of course the Defense Department or War Department's relationship with Hollywood goes back as far back as right after World War I or before World War I, using celebrity movie stars for bond drives and such, but even the creation of movies and these things. And of course the British were very heavily involved in Hollywood in the late 30s and 40s with the Quarter Circle. Manipulating movies and culture and the messages in those movies. The Disney Corporation was taken over by the War Department throughout the entire Second World War, and they never quite left it. So, I mean, this type of media, this type of manipulation.
But then, how do you get? Yeah, let me. If I could just say, I believe, for example, MK Ultra is a real thing, and that I think I mentioned in an email to you that I have a friend who was close to one of the scientists who worked on that program. Mm-hmm. So I believe the MK Ultra thing, the Mockingbird stuff, the control of media by someone. I mean, the CIA seems as good a candidate for anybody. I believe that. So there are obviously powers behind the media, behind the government, and in some ways behind the universities that we don't really know much about. And they do probably almost entirely only detrimental things. Mm-hmm. I don't question that at all. I think that one of my concerns is when we look at what's happening to the world and to our society, if we focus entirely on the deep state and these multi-thousand-year-old conspiracies, what we fail to do is see what our part in it is. And one of the things I liked about the interview that you just did with Joe Atwill on gender inversion and family and marriage is toward the end of that interview. It was mainly Joe was basically saying to people, if you want to have a workable family, a workable marriage, you've got to look at yourself and you've got to face what you're up against. And most of what you're up against, I think he said, is yourself. And that's kind of how I think people ought to look at what's going on with, the church world, the political world, family and stuff. All of these things, there has been a concerted effort to destroy the family, to destroy gender. There's no question about it. And I actually know some things that would make, a lot of people wouldn't want to know. But the fact is it's worked rather well. And how could that happen unless we've allowed it and some part of us wanted it to work? I mean, if someone is selling crystal meth on your street and you become a crystal meth addict, it's because you decided to take the crystal meth, right?
Yes.
So I think that we need to try to figure out why we're so vulnerable to, we can't control election fraud, people cheating on the ballot boxes or the voting machines. We can't control, we can't do anything about what's going on in the banking system and things like that. But in terms of the level that you guys were talking about in that interview, you and Joe Atwill, we do have something to say about how we think and act ourselves. And if we are gender confused, and I think our society basically is generally gender confused, we don't resemble Americans of 100 years ago. Our marriages don't resemble them. Our attitudes about the role of husband and wife, mother and father, where the mother should be when there are children, should she be out in a career, should she be at home. We don't resemble our grandparents and great-grandparents. So we've got to take some blame for that. And when we look at what's wrong with our churches, I think it's much more productive, or our educational institutions, I think it's much more productive, Tim, for us to figure out in what way are we voting with our feet and making this happen while we complain about it and blame people far away that we, when we're taking their crystal meth. See?
Yeah, I know. You don't want to absolve people of personal responsibility and say they don't have free will, but you do have to acknowledge coercion when it exists and high level malfeasance and that's when you have to address things like the culture creators, whether it's Hollywood and the malevolent forces that control the cinema and the fact that it is organized and, as Joe Atwill says, it's not a cesspool, it's a weapon, and that implies intent, willful intent, malicious intent. And I think raising consciousness about the malevolence is a part, and once you raise the consciousness, then you can you can strengthen the free will. Because then once people are aware of it, if you expose the psychological warfare, it blunts it. It blunts it as a weapon. And so I understand what you're saying, but nevertheless, is when you have examples of high-level malevolence being conducted through the foundations, through the publishing houses like Time Life, coordinating with Hollywood to produce certain types of movies to alter the culture, for malevolent reasons, we have to point that out, especially when it comes, because one thing is when you, well, here, back to the CNP, gives them, when you're talking about something like the CNP being an intelligence asset, and how this might be an example of the powers that be wanting to control the debate, keeping within a certain arena so they can control it. And evidence for that is something that is, a prominent member of the CNP is Richard Viguerie, who is this, king, this Grand Poobah of direct mail. Well, his connection, part of his success can be explained by his links to the intelligence community and his role in that. And I'm just saying can be, because there's some evidence that, in the 1980s, he got in some financial problems, and he was bailed out by by the South Korean CIA. They bought his building for like $10 million or something over market value. And, well, he played an important role in mobilizing the conservative movement behind things like Iran-Contra. And if you look at Iran-Contra wasn't just a scheme to fund anti-communist rebels in Nicaragua. That was the cover. It was a huge operation to fund an illegal arms shipping and drug shipping operation, shipping arms into Central America, stealing them from NATO storehouses. Oliver North was doing that. He was stripping our defenses in Europe to smuggle these weapons. This also involved the Israelis, and of course, then it also it involved the shipment of cocaine into places like Mena, Arkansas, and the Clintons, and this ties the Clintons in with the Bushes. So this betrays the entire fraud of the American political system of Republican versus Democrat, and a lot of the cocaine found its way into South Central L.A., which is exposed by Gary Webb in the Dark Alliance series, which then the CIA worked, and we know this now, to destroy his career for exposing this thing. And so, it's pretty bad. And so you have this...
To destroy whose career?
Gary Webb's. Worked for the San Jose Mercury News. And he was run out of the business for being a reporter. And the Washington Post, did this. And also, of course, at the same time, you have the South Korean CIA working through the Unification Church to fund things like the Washington Times. So this is all, they're controlling both sides here. And of course, the Washington Post has long been exposed as an organ of the CIA. Katharine Graham, Donald Graham, just the connections are all part of the George, and this all relates to the Georgetown set. Again, we're talking about a milieu of people of, they screw each other, they marry each other, they party together, they have the same interests, the same outlook, and doesn't necessarily have to be a conspiracy, it's just how they view the world. And all this is justified. And this is all part of that, the milieu of, you call it the WASP establishment, plenty of Catholics want to join it, that's part of the problem. In D.C. is Catholics wanting political power in the United States. It's difficult to do that and stay being a Catholic. But that's my point and so you have this, that I think the story of someone like, Richard Viguerie is a great example of, well, the evidence is very suggestive, that his role was to more mobilize conservative cover for this illegal operation that involved Colonel North and the Bushes out of the National Security Council during the Reagan administration. And again, there's no direct memorandum or anything saying CIA working with the Clintons, but it was all there. And it was done, And the same way that we have evidence of in the 80s with early 80s when the Attorney General of the United States, William Finch Smith, signed a memorandum of understanding with the CIA that there would be no legal consequences for CIA officers not reporting drug smuggling. And this was the run-up to the dirty war in Central America. And, of course, in the 80s at the time, I thought the Reagan administration was fighting the expansion of communism in Latin America. And it turns out that the whole thing was just a fraud.
Yeah.
Planning false stories about Soviet MiGs showing up in Nicaragua, these things. And the newspapers are doing, it's all being coordinated. So
at the meta level, or just looking at an end game, you've done some very interesting, provocative interviews with a whole variety of people. And one of the questions that, comes to my mind each time I listen to one, and other people doing somewhat similar stuff out there, the question that keeps coming to my mind is, okay, what if you could push a button and drain the swamp, or eliminate the New World Order, the Illuminati, the CFR, just whoever at the CFR is at the center of their, sinister operations. What if you could just tomorrow have all those people gone out of Hollywood, out of Washington, out of the state capitals? Where would that leave us? How much of a difference would it make in our society if all of those operations suddenly, were divinely extinguished? Let's put it that way. Where would that leave the rest of us?
Well, this is part of the trap of the current system. I think it was. I think most people have no idea how the current banking system, the current economy, is based on things like, like the international narcotics trade, and perhaps this is how they justify it. It's almost like, do you remember the movie 3 Days of the Condor?
I remember the title. With
Robert Redford. There's a scene in it. Cliff Robertson plays the CIA, his handler, the typical nihilistic, cynical CIA, justifying everything. And at the end, more naively, is Robert Redford's going to go to the New York Times to publish a story that's going to break the story. If you believe the New York Times, is a real journalistic endeavor, going to do that. But for the sake of the movies, he's threatening to go to the Washington Times to the New York Times, rather. I'm sorry. And Cliff Robertson says, "You do that, you realize what you're going to do." And he goes, "What?" And he says, "Well, first of all," and it's funny because the scandal was there was a CIA plot. There was a member of the CIA who had devised a plan to provoke a war in the Middle East to give the U.S. a pretext to go in and invade Saudi Arabia, I believe, in the story. This is, I think, around 1975, they're doing this. And it's kind of funny because Richard Helms, actually, the former CIA director, consulted on the film. I think Sidney Pollack was. No, I don't think Sidney Pollack was the director of that. But anyway, they're on the street there, and he goes, we have to do. I'm paraphrasing now. He says, "We have to do this. Why? What's going to happen when people go hungry and their children are cold? They're really hungry and they're cold. They're going to want us to do this. They're going to want us to do this. And you think when people are really hungry and they have no food and have no heat, they're going to want us to go and invade and play these dirty games." Now, what I'm saying is the presumption is that American prosperity, the American economy, the American way of life, is based ultimately on theft and murder. And the idea is to turn the other, don't look at it, let the bad guys do what they have to do to keep the game going. Well, that's not true. That's not true at all, actually. The world would be a lot wealthier, if we didn't engage in these things. In fact, if people were allowed to reach their full potential throughout the world, and real honest trade and friendship existed, and we didn't go out and stage coups so we could get assets on the cheap for the benefit of ExxonMobil, United Fruit Company, whatever. Now, what I'm saying, my point is, a long way to getting around to it is that if we suddenly ended the game, there'd be immediate consequences because the system would collapse because it's based on graft and corruption.
So when you say it's not true, just to be precise, Tim, what you're saying is not true is that in the end it works out better for us. But I think you are, if I understand, you are saying, oh yeah, sure, it's true that our economy and our society is based on fundamental corruptions,
yes,
right?
Yes.
Okay. But you're saying what's not true is that it has to be that way.
No, because it doesn't have to be that way because a small group of people had set up a system that benefits them directly, and the American people get a few crumbs, and that's called prosperity. And I think now less people are getting their beak wet, so there's more anxiety now than before. And the American economy is fundamentally unsound, but it's based on it's based on bond fraud and inflation and currency manipulation and the threat of war and the Pentagon to back up the U.S. dollar ultimately. I guess Catherine Austin Fitz gives a talk. She is a former assistant director of HUD, and her story at HUD and the corruption she exposed there, the black budget and the money the trillions of dollars that have been stolen to do God knows what. But she gives a story. She has a speech where it's called the Red Pill speech. And she's in front of 150, 200 God-fearing Christians, as she describes it. And she explains how the role narcotics plays in funding Wall Street, keeping the banks solvent, ultimately keeping their pension checks going, and keeping their 401ks inflated so they can have the illusion of wealth and prosperity. And she says, if I could get rid of drugs, get drugs off the street right now, shut down the drug trade, and by pressing this red button, but it would cause your 401k to drop by 75%, and maybe your pension checks to be cut or stopped. Would you support it? And she says, out of 150 people, 2 raised their hand.
Yeah, I think she said. I've heard this. I think she said 1.
Maybe 1. Maybe I'm being more optimistic.
But this is exactly that's exactly my point.
Yeah.
In a way, ironically, as much as I respect Catherine Fitz, it's a sort of a contradiction of her eternal optimism about the American people. How can you tell that story and be as optimistic as she is?
Yes.
Now, and that's really what I was asking when I said, okay, if you could push a button and remove all of these, black ops at the CIA and, whatever's going on that's, diabolical at CFR and everywhere else, in the bank and on Wall Street, what would we be left with? What would we have to look in the mirror at if all that were gone? And when you break down what Catherine Austin Fitz was saying in that story, what she was saying is the American people are not just whores. They're willing to have other people die in large numbers, live in poverty, or spend their lives in prison, often in many cases, as she explained it, young black males, being rounded up off the streets. As a whole, it would take a long time to go into what she was describing. But she said, people, I'm talking about people who are attracted to her services as a professional and her character and personality, which, has got to be a pretty good selection of people, right? And yet, looking her in the eye, they had to say, no, we'd like the system to continue sacrificing large numbers of young people in our communities. That's what people want. Now, what this means is, in a sense, not to reduce it to a cliche, but don't we have the conspiracy we deserve? Aren't we the conspiracy? Isn't this sort of God's way of saying, well, I've warned you, I've told you, if you aren't going to be my children, you're going to be someone else's children, and we know who that is. So you're going to live with the consequences. And I don't think that there's, I look at people in the world of evangelical churches and social activism, people that 20 years ago I thought were the salt of the earth, the last American heroes, American pastors and pro-life activists and whatever. I got to know these people and I think, well, wow, yuck. And not every single one of them, but overwhelmingly. The males are emasculated. The women are pushy and demanding. They're not people who have a biblical or Christian character type that they pretend to in church or whatever. There's something so wrong with our general population that we can't do anything but keep buying the crack that's being put out there.
Well, there's been an alchemical process that's been formed against the American people for the better part of 60 years. In my other interviews, I've covered at least how that was done, and there is a conspiracy there to the extent that there was social engineering being carried out, by the great foundations to promote certain memes and ideas in the media, certain figures, certain change agents, whether it's, Allen Ginsberg, Gloria Steinem, Hugh Hefner, even William F. Buckley. And these were figures there.
Yeah, Alfred Kinsey.
Alfred Kinsey, Time Magazine, that was the Rockefeller Foundation, Ford Foundation, these things. And this gets into that broader issue. You talked about it with Thomas, sort of the culture war aspect of this and what's occurred. And again, how, the sort of the internalization. We've internalized these bad ideas, but largely because it's been these supposed radical ideas had the support of the corporate power structure, and that's supposed to be conservative. So that's.
See, I think that my approach is more psychological and spiritual than. I think the things that happen in the political and economic world are outworkings or manifestations of things that are. Well, your title of your program is Powers and Principalities, so we know where that comes from. It's a biblical expression. I think that what we're seeing in terms of the disgendering of America, the destruction of the family, the crass materialism, the willingness to have other people have their lives destroyed, and it doesn't impact us as far as we're concerned. This is basically at the nature of fallen man. It's not something you have to be taught. It's something you don't have to be poisoned to be like that. You have to have something lift you out of that condition. That's the Christian view, right? That unless something spectacular, miraculous happens to you or to your society, it's going to be corrupt and violent, unjust. There are going to be all kinds of conspiracies and mafias, and it's going to be systemic oppression of various types, unless something prevents it from being that way. That's the default. The default condition that we should expect is a dysfunctional society with lots of people being essentially sacrificed to Baal.
Yeah.
Right? And the abortion thing is just one example. There are powers and principalities that want blood, and it's hardwired into us as fallen creatures to collaborate in that system. It wasn't that hard for the Bolsheviks to get tens of millions of Russians and other citizens of what became the Soviet Union to go along. It wasn't hard for the Nazis. It wasn't hard for Chairman Mao. It's not that hard to get people to do this stuff.
That's true, but again, all those events, whether it's the rise of the Third Reich, Chairman Mao in China, even the Bolsheviks, all had very important funding from London and Wall Street.
Fair enough.
I mean, the culture, it moves on its own, but it can be pushed fairly easily, especially if you have a well-financed, well-organized power elite, an elite that's dedicated to the degradation and weakening of society, as opposed to its edification and improvement. And we have a hostile elite, and you have to identify that because part of sort of appealing to our own free will, our own inner strength, is also acknowledging our enemies. Christ told us to love our enemies, but not deny that we have them. And we also were told to be as clever as serpents and as gentle as lambs. I think it goes. So, but there is organized malevolence, and there's examples of specific institutions and individuals being paid money, organizing to do things. And the great example, I just recently did a show with Joe talking about the foundations and how the foundations are an instrument for this stuff. And one of the things that the foundations were used for was to create the culture war. The culture was also created by things like the Vietnam War. Wars are a great social engineering endeavor. And there's no better way, and that the foundations themselves admitted back in, this was with Catherine Casey during the investigator for the Carol Reese Committee. She was sent up to in New York in the 1950s to read the minutes of the Carnegie Corporation. And when she came back, she had a nervous breakdown. What she found out was these foundations, the Carnegie Foundation, had determined that the most effective way to fundamentally alter American life and bring it towards collectivism. Also, the plan was to merge it with the Soviet Union. There was a later plan in the 30s and 40s. Was war. And lo and behold, this was 1909, 1910 that these minutes were being... In the next 30 years, America found itself... In fact, the next 30 years, if you count Korea and Vietnam, the next 70 years, America found itself constantly at war. And it fundamentally changed American society. World War I and World War II. E. Michael Jones has done fabulous research regarding the weaponization of civil rights and the integration of the urban neighborhoods to break up the ethnic neighborhoods so they could weaken the power of the Catholic Church in mid-century America, because the WASP establishment was very suspicious of Catholic power. And they wrote about it, like Paul Blanchard wrote about Catholic power and American freedom. And the idea was that the Catholics were too numerous, they didn't practice birth control, and that needed to change. And one way you achieve that was to break up the neighborhoods and create suburbia. And suburbia wasn't a market process, that was social engineering, the interstate highway system and these things. And this was done to change the demographics, to change the culture, because much of the upheaval we had in the 60s, the sexual revolution, simply would have been possible with America, with its demographics in the 1930s or 40s. And what was shocking to me is just how people had planned this out. It wasn't just history unfolding in these things. So you do have malevolent forces. A good example is sex education. And that was done. You mentioned how Planned Parenthood in 1969 planned this all out. And
well, it wasn't. You mean that other interview? It wasn't Planned Parenthood. Actually, this is the woman that I mentioned to Thomas Henry Horan that I suggested. Yeah. I would recommend you interview. Her name is Erin Bizzy. She's in Britain, and she was a feminist, and she personally participated in a meeting in Washington in 1969 of British and American feminists, maybe Canadian and I don't know, French, German. They tended to be mainly the wives of prominent Marxist men, and they laid out essentially what Western society was going to turn into as regards family, marriage, and gender. And it was laid out, as she described it, essentially as a conspiracy to destroy society.
Yeah.
And to redefine the family as, put it ironically, a Madonna and child, or Madonna and children, mother and children. And whereas historically in the biblical scheme of the family and society, the father, the family belongs to the father, the children are his seed. Legally, in fact, in Western law, the children and the wife were the property of the father in a certain sense. And in fact, there was you mentioned the WASP conspiracy against the Catholics, and probably in the eastern cities, Maine. I'm sure that's true. But there was a decision a little over 100 years ago in Minnesota called the Flint decision, in which the Catholic Church played a role in overturning. They advocated for a Catholic woman who had married either an apostate or an atheist man. They had children, and then the marriage was going to break up. And legally, under those the rules at the time, the children would have gone with their father, which would have been, regardless of the fact that he was a pagan or whatever, or at least not Catholic, whatever, was the law and the way things functioned in Western civilization. Now, the decision overturned, and it was a landmark decision, and that's one of the sort of pivotal points in the march of feminism. If you can look in the upper Midwest, you can see it's sort of ironic collaboration of the Catholic Church, but I think especially Protestants from Scandinavia, Finland, and mostly the Protestant immigrants from Northern Europe who came with, especially from Scandinavia, sort of socialist and other left-wing progressive ideas, and they created this Midwestern kind of flirtation with the left, which still exists in Wisconsin, Minnesota, Kansas, all those areas. These things go back before the 20th century, well before. They go back, in some ways, prior to the Civil War. Feminism was already trying to piggyback on the anti-slavery battle, and the long-term vision of some of these women was to destroy the family. I mean, Susan B. Anthony was probably in a lesbian relationship with her best friend. I'm trying to remember her name. Almost equally well-known feminist. It was all undercover, and she played the good cop, and the other woman was the more radical. This stuff goes back well before, even before the Civil War.
That's Stanton?
Yes, Stanton.
Okay. Canton Stanton or so Kathy Stanton.
Kate, I think Elizabeth Cady Stanton.
Elizabeth Cady Stanton, yeah.
Yeah, they probably had a lesbian relationship. You look at the letters between them; it's pretty sticky.